it is yet again another evidence of the fact that our government agencies will resort to incredibly inhumane and cruel, as well as illegal, means in order to destroy dissent. I'm all too familiar with it.
The question was about solar. Can we please have the lights turned off? No, not those lights. Somebody wants to tape this, and they refuse to turn those lights off. We can't answer questions from anybody outside the first 10 rows because we can't see anyone with those lights on. There we go. Now I can see at least 50 feet here. The question was, what is the best way, incentives or investments to get to solar energy? The best way is to start with what is practical and on the shelf right now, and then work towards the more exotic and far-off things. We're doing exactly the reverse. We're working on the futuristic, insane projects and holding back everything that's practical right now. 40% of the government solar energy budget goes for 2 projects. One is a gigantic space satellite that is supposed to float out there and collect radiant energy, and then by microwaves bring it back to collectors in the desert, from which I gather they will rent electricity to countries that are less fortunate than ours. And the other one is a gigantic power tower in a desert 300 feet high that is surrounded by mirrors that reflect light back onto it, the sort of thing you learn in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, for the brilliant purpose of boiling water, from which you generate electricity through turbines and generators. This is solar energy built in the image of nuclear power. This is solar energy built in the image of the military-industrial complex. This is a waste of money, pure and simple. Or if it's not, then before we study the applications of solar in outer space, let's make sure we've done everything that's practical now. The most important thing is to provide the homeowner with a loan so that they can afford the initial cost of putting in a system. The second most important thing is to require conservation and to make loans available on the resale of houses, so you can't sell a house in this country without making sure that it's insulated. And the cost ought not to be borne by the person buying or selling. The cost ought to be borne by the utilities or the banks by making an easy, long-term, low-interest loan, since if they don't do it, the total cost of the house is going to go through the roof because of the rising gas bills that people are going to have to pay in the future. How can they make 20-year, multi-million-dollar loans to the nuclear plants and then say they won't make a $2,000 loan to a homeowner who wants to insulate their house? That's the simplest way to live. There are tremendous examples around the country. The Portland City Council has passed the most far-reaching energy conservation law in the country. San Diego County, California has passed a solar ordinance requiring solar energy in all new residential construction. Franklin County, Vermont has decided to become a northeastern capital of the wood-burning stove industry and get out of the kick of the famous gold medallion all-electric homes of the 1950s and 60s. It's happening on local levels. The key is incentives, tax credits, and loans to consumers for technology that's already there. It's working, but people can't afford it if it means choosing between their doctor bills and their energy bills. So we think that's the simplest approach. How How do property rights and nonviolence fit in with economic democracy? I wondered who was in those compartments up there. Let me answer the first and then get a clarification on the second. We believe in individual private property and family farms, in solar energy businesses, and the maximum private property where it works according to the old rules, where the consumer meets the producer and there's a real interaction, and it's possible for the consumer to know who they're buying from. We feel that a lot of private property in this country is that in name only. We feel that we own houses, but they're actually owned by banks, and our mortgage payments are really a form of rent. We think people ought to have genuine home ownership. Renters ought to have the entitlement to become homeowners in a condominium sense if they've been in their apartment for 10 years instead of being kicked out at the whim of speculators. As far as the large-scale property, we don't feel that this country's gas and oil or water or natural resources belong to anyone, because nobody really has a patent on them or discovered them. They're part of creation. They're part of the universe. They belong to all of us, and those energy resources ought to be owned by the public sector, and if the private sector is to be involved, it ought to be on a contract basis. We should not allow the ownership of our own environment to be controlled by people who may want to make money off of it, may want to preserve it, may want to build a condominium. We can do business with a small oil company or a large one, but we ought not to give away ownership of our resources. Now, on the second one, on violence and nonviolence, what was the question? Well, we started 200 years ago with the concept of property and individual rights that only gave propertied white males the right to vote. Since that time, a whole lot of other people have gotten the right to vote and other rights, and sometimes there's been violence, but it's usually been a combination of demonstrations, boycotts, organizations, labor organizations, running candidates for office. It's been a combination of methods, but I can't think of any right that we have that was given to us by the King of England or by a giant corporation. I can only think of every right that we have, including the Bill of Rights and free speech, being gradually won by the American people through a variety of efforts. And I assume that what we're talking about tonight, if it's acceptable to a majority of people, will be won over the next 10 years through all kinds of efforts. I don't see any need for violence. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But well, we have enough of that now, but I fail to see why moving towards solar energy will impose a Soviet-style tyranny on the American people. I think it's ridiculous.
We're going to take one more question, so we should announce the surveys.
Where are they?
I think I have them. They should turn them into the ushers.
I want to take a question from the highest person in the audience, physically speaking, not you. This person there. But before you begin, hold on, don't stand up. This terrorizes us. There's a survey form that has been left on your seats, and if you can fill it out, turn it into the ushers or send it to us. The address is on the back. It's the thing that she asked about. She'd already gotten to question 19 about medical policy. The reason that we're asking people to fill it out is that it gives us a better sense of the audiences we're speaking to. And when the journalists or politicians ask us, what do these large crowds of people, which may come to maybe as many as 100,000 people in this month, really think, we don't have to guess from your questions or your smiles or your frowns. We can say, well, we've collated all these surveys, and here's what they think, and you ought not to neglect these people. You ought to pay attention to them. We'll send back to you the results of the survey so you can see the attitudes of the people who came here tonight.
And it
We would be much obliged if you took the time, the 10 minutes or so that it takes to fill it out and
send it to us. Thank you.
Now your question. Where would the government funds for a solar program come from? Well, part of the role of government in developing solar energy, it seems to me, is to help small and medium-sized businesses stay alive by buying their products in the same way that the government buys tanks from companies that make tanks. There's nothing that prohibits the government from buying solar cells from small companies to create a market. That would pay its way back to the American people at no greater cost than the cost of energy today. It just would mean buying one source of electricity instead of another. Secondly, in terms of government already spends a lot of money on research and development that benefits the large corporations. That's tax dollars going to subsidize the private sector. I'd like to see the government unlock a lot of the patents in this country, patents on solar devices that are merely a way to seize the future and put it on the shelf. And the government ought to be subsidizing research and development that helps the small entrepreneurs and the real inventors in this country who often lose that kind of opportunity when they lose control over their inventions. Finally, it seems to me that we could spend $30 to $50 billion on what's known as the MX missile, which apparently is a chip that we're giving to our generals in exchange for their supporting the SALT II agreements. This little missile runs on a railroad track out in Nevada, which is being built. I think it's a little preposterous. It's certainly not for national defense. It is simply part of the wheeling and dealing of domestic politics. I think that defense spending is inherently inflationary. Every weapon turns out to cost 3 times as much as it was originally promised. It floods the economy with dollars, but not with products. I'm amazed at conservative economists defending military spending while attacking the government for causing inflation, because military spending is our greatest single form of inflation. And all that'll happen is we'll put it on this little track out there, and the Russians will say, gee, we can't hit that thing because it's moving. Look how clever those Americans are. So the Russians will instead aim at one of our nuclear power plants and blow it up. And then we'll say, well, we ought to put them on little trolley tracks, when instead we should take the same money, instead of giving it to a mass transit system for missiles, we should invest it in a mass transit system for Los Angeles so we can stop wasting gas.
Which would also put a whole lot more people to work, which would also then make it possible to reduce welfare and unemployment. If we reinvested our national priorities, our national money differently, we could provide more jobs and be able to cut back on government spending on those kind of social programs. I'm getting all kinds of signals that we have to go now, so let's take one more.
Well, one thing as a young person, maybe Jane and I can both answer this as we wrap up, you should be aware that there is a move to reinstate the military conscription. It's another interesting thing. Conservatives, true conservatives who are against government, ought to be against the draft, but it's often self-proclaimed conservatives in Washington who are the first to want to snatch young men out of the campuses and put them to war in the Middle East in behalf of the oil companies. The tanks are being repainted from jungle green to desert tan out where I come from. Secondly, I think that you should figure out a way to begin now to dedicate part of your life, since you're going to dedicate part of your income in the form of taxes, dedicate part of your life to politics, to fighting for campaign reform and for the elimination of this ability of special interest groups to buy candidates. There ought to be limitations on all kinds of contributions. There ought to be much more independence. about whether or not you register Democrat
or not.
You ought to be demanding of even the good members of Congress from this
State.
do not have a political organization they're accountable to. They don't have advisory groups. They're not required to meet with citizens groups. I think that the two-party system will gradually die of its own weight. But if people like yourselves come in and say, hey, we'll walk a precinct, we'll kick in a little money out of our paycheck, but what we want in return is that in our office or our factory or our farm or our school, we want you, the candidate, to meet with us before you run for office and meet with us after you run for office, and then our volunteer energy will be going for something that's meaningful. I think that candidates can't just buy elections. They need people. They need people like yourselves. They need students. They need idealists. They need people to lick stamps and knock on doors and raise dust. And that gives you a certain amount of power. It doesn't have to require all your life, but it means saying, hey, we're not just going to vote for good people. We want them to give us a voice in their program. So when they go to Washington and they come back, they'll meet with us again, almost like you sign a contract with an employer if you're in a union. We need that concept for political volunteers in party politics because the platforms are becoming not worth the paper they're written on. The platform ought to be a contract, and you ought to just be willing to say, I don't care if you're a good person. I don't care if you're a good person. I will go out of my way to vote for somebody worse just to teach you a lesson unless you start adhering to the contract, because I don't get anything out of this unless I get some social change that improves my condition. So those kinds of, I think the country is ripe for either a reform of the two-party system or the development of a third party, because it isn't working. You haven't seen any volunteers knocking on doors for candidates, have you? I don't think you will. That's a thing of the past. And to get people back into politics, I think politics is going to have to change. Politicians are going to have to change. These tired old political organizations in every state are going to have to be phased out and replaced with some new faces. So that would be my political study of the kind of things that you could be doing.
I just would like to add to that no matter what it is that you're going to be doing when you graduate or what kind of major you're taking now or headed for, you can find a way to make it a forward-looking profession. If you're teaching, really teach, not these whitewashed textbooks that I've seen lurking around schools that don't even mention how we arrived at 8-hour day working in this country and who died for it and who fought for it and what really was the women's movement about and who are the real heroes and heroines in this country. And if you're an engineer, what's the name of that guy we met today? Not Dennis Day. Who? Lorenzo. Lorenzen. Perry. Where was he from? You've got farmers in this state that we were with this morning that are like engineers that are coming up with solutions to our energy problems that, of course, the professors tell them don't work. And I've met a few elsewhere in this country, nuclear physicists like Professor Hieronymus back there in New England, who was destined to work for the Trident submarine and decided instead to use all of his skills and expertise in developing thermal ocean energy and developing offshore windmills, and use your skills in a socially responsible and productive way. There's always a way that you can do it. And you've been a great audience. Thank you very much.
They are going to
Iowa City.
now, driving, and then we'll be in Youngstown, Ohio, or evening. So they do more than an 8-hour day.
Okay.